At 5:14 local time, the first impact did not announce itself like a blast. It moved through the carrier as something heavier, deeper, and more unsettling. A hard pressure wave rolled into the hull, the kind of shock that did not roar so much as bury itself into the steel. Cups rattled in the ready room. Fine dust shook loose from seams overhead. Men walking through narrow passageways froze for half a second, caught between routine and instinct. On the flight deck, a yellow shirt turned sharply toward the island before he even understood why. Below decks, in compartments still glowing, under the dim lighting of late-night operations, heads lifted at almost the exact same moment. Then the general quarters alarm ripped across the ship. Red lights flashed. Watertight doors began cycling shut. Boots struck steel decks in rapid rhythm. Voices that had been tired, low, and half awake only seconds earlier became sharp and focused. Orders came in clipped bursts. The carrier had been moving under the strict calm of nighttime routine. Less than 3 seconds later, it was shifting into full defensive posture. No one on board knew exactly what had happened yet. In Damage Control Central, the first reports arrived in fragments. No active fire. No major flooding in the main engineering spaces. No immediate sign of a full hull rupture, but something had happened underwater. Just beyond the outer defensive envelope. Close enough to be felt across the ship, close enough to change everything. Inside the Combat Information Center, the watch teams were already moving. One sonar feed from an escort destroyer spiked with sudden transient noise. Another reported cavitation in the water south of the formation. A tactical action officer leaned over the display, eyes locked on the unfolding picture, listening as short bursts of contact data came in from ships outside the carrier's own steel walls. Bearings were called. Distances were estimated. Someone asked if it could have been a mine. Another suggested submerged debris. No one wanted to say the word torpedo yet. Not until the second report came in. Underwater disturbance confirmed. Possible high-speed track. Bearing steady. That changed the air in the room. The carrier itself remained steady, but the formation around it began to move. One escort destroyer widened to starboard. Another adjusted course outward, expanding the protective screen. On the bridge, new maneuvering recommendations came in. On the flight deck, crews who had expected routine pre-dawn operations now watched armed helicopters being brought forward with sudden purpose. Then came the third call. Multiple submerged contacts. Not one, multiple. The temperature inside CIC seemed to drop. A watch supervisor stepped closer to the tactical plot as the symbols updated. One uncertain contact became two, then two became three. Separate bearings, separate movement patterns, all underwater. All inside a sector that no one wanted occupied at that hour. 3 submarines. The possibility of an accident vanished in that moment. This was not drifting metal. It was not a false sonar bloom. It was not some isolated underwater irregularity. Somewhere out in the dark water beyond the visible horizon, 3 Iranian submarines had moved into dangerous proximity around an American formation. One of them had already acted, or had acted too early. The carrier's captain did not need a speech. He needed a clear picture. Assess hull, continue contact development, launch the helos. That was enough. The orders moved fast because everyone on board understood the stakes without needing them explained. Aircraft carrier crews live inside procedure for exactly this reason. When danger arrives, time cannot be wasted on confusion. The system has to take over. Across the ship, discipline replaced uncertainty. Damage control teams isolated affected sections and searched for hidden deformation. Engineering confirmed propulsion remained stable. Communications pushed short encrypted messages to the escorts. Flight deck crews shifted from normal sequencing to defensive support operations. Above the waterline, the carrier still looked massive and steady, a dark shape cutting through the last blue-black layer before dawn. But beneath that calm image, every system had changed. Every radar operator, every bridge watch stander, every sailor moving through red-lit passageways understood the same thing. Something had entered the screen that did not belong there. On the nearest destroyer, sonar operators worked the contacts with intense focus, trying to separate real movement from the clutter of the sea. One contact was deep and disciplined. One was shifting quickly, too quickly for comfort. The third seemed to be drifting along the edge of the formation, almost as if the crew below had realized too late that they were not where they thought they were. That possibility spread quietly before anyone said it aloud. The wrong target. The first submarine had not found an isolated logistics ship. It had not struck a tanker trailing behind the formation. It had not reached some soft outer vessel moving alone in the dark. It had pushed into the defensive orbit of a United States aircraft carrier strike group and made contact at the worst possible moment for itself, just before the Americans fully revealed their response. And now that response was unfolding. Rotors began turning on the flight deck. The carrier adjusted into the wind. Escort ships pushed outward, creating distance, angles, and engagement space. Tactical displays sharpened as more acoustic information poured in. Somewhere beneath the surface, the three submarines were no longer moving through darkness on their own terms. They were inside a tightening American grid. In that narrow transition between hidden approach and full exposure, the entire encounter changed. They thought they had found a vulnerable American hull. What they had actually touched was the center of a U.S. Navy defensive trap. The first seconds after the alarm belonged to uncertainty. The next minutes belonged to sonar. No one in the strike group was looking at the ocean as empty water anymore. It had become a layered map of noise, shadow, temperature, speed, and intention. Every bearing mattered. Every pause mattered even more. Inside the sonar room of the outer screen destroyer, headsets stayed pressed tight as operators worked through the flood of underwater returns. Machinery hum, hull flow, marine life, distant shipping, thermal distortion. Every layer had to be peeled away until only the real contacts remained. 3 had already been called. Now the question was what kind of 3 they were. One was deep, one was moving, one was trying very hard not to exist at all. Back on the carrier, Combat Information Center absorbed the reports and rebuilt the battle space in real time. Symbols shifted, bearings adjusted, a maneuver arrow shortened, then lengthened. The officer at the tactical display did not waste words. He watched the geometry tighten around the formation and understood what it meant. The first impact had not ended the danger. It had announced it. Escort screen expanding, airborne anti-submarine operations launching, track continuity intermittent on contact 3. That last word hung in the air. Intermittent. That was the word nobody wanted to hear. Outside, pre-dawn darkness still pressed low over the water, but the flight deck had completely changed character. The MH-60R Seahawks were no longer being moved for routine cycles. They were being prepared to search, track, and, if necessary, force the submarines out of hiding. Crew chiefs guided them into position under sharp hand signals and rotating red deck lights. Weapons crews moved quickly but with control. No wasted motion, no panic. Everyone on deck understood that if a submarine stayed hidden, the helicopters would become the strike group's eyes and hands in the water. The first Seahawk lifted hard into the morning haze. Then the second followed. Below them, the carrier kept moving, but the formation around it was spreading into a hunting pattern. Destroyers adjusted their lanes to create overlapping sonar fields. One ship lowered its towed array deeper into cleaner water. Another moved outward to close a likely escape route. The carrier remained the center of mass, but the fight was being pushed away from its hull and into the ocean around it. That was the design. One Iranian submarine had already revealed impatience. That alone made it dangerous. A submarine commander who knows he may have been detected does not become less of a threat. He becomes harder to predict. He may dive deeper, he may go silent, he may attempt another move, or he may try to hide beneath the noise of his own confusion and search for one more chance. In the sonar picture, the contacts began to separate by behavior. The first moved low and deliberately, trying to settle beneath the thermal layer where sound bends and tracking becomes less reliable. The second accelerated at the wrong moment, pushing enough water across its control surfaces to sharpen its acoustic signature. The third barely moved at all. That third contact was the most unsettling one on the board because it gave away the least. Contact 2 opening speed, Contact 1 descending, Contact 3 weak, possible creep. That was enough to form an outline. These were not 3 submarines wandering independently through tense waters. This was coordinated movement. Not perfect, not clean enough to remain hidden after the first contact, but coordinated all the same. Their angles were different, their depths were different, their roles were different. One had likely committed too early. One was maneuvering to recover the geometry. One was preserving silence for the moment that mattered most. The helicopters reached station and began laying the first sonobuoy pattern. Canisters struck the sea one after another, small against the dark surface, each opening a new listening point beneath the water. Data began streaming back in fragments and pulses. The ocean started speaking louder. Acoustic lines formed, broke, and formed again across the tactical display. One Seahawk slowed into a hover and lowered its dipping sonar into the water column, searching vertically while the destroyers searched laterally. Then one contact shifted fast, too fast to ignore. Inside CIC, several heads turned at the same time as the projected path updated toward the outer edge of the carrier's route. It was not a direct run, not yet, but it was movement with purpose. Possible repositioning. That possibility drove the next set of orders. One destroyer angled harder across the sector. Another adjusted to close the gap. Active sonar was considered, then held back for a few more seconds while passive teams tried to preserve the picture. An active ping would light up the water, but it would also tell every submarine below that the Americans had moved from suspicion to certainty. The delay did not last, because then one of the 3 contacts disappeared. Not faded, disappeared. An operator rechecked the bearing, another checked for layer interference. A supervisor leaned over the console, waiting for the return to reappear. It did not. For several seconds, the strike group held only 2 firm pictures out of 3. And those were the most dangerous seconds so far. A submarine that cannot be tracked is not simply missing, it is free. Free to drift toward a firing lane. Free to change depth beneath a projected course. Free to turn an early mistake into a deliberate second move. That changed the emotional center of the encounter. The Americans were no longer only reacting to what had happened. They were racing to prevent what could happen next. Overhead, the dipping sonar returned a fleeting anomaly. Weak, narrow, not enough for certainty, but enough to draw attention. Seconds later, a destroyer reported a stronger bearing line. A Seahawk crew called possible convergence from buoy data. The tactical plot began to tighten again. The missing contact was not fully recovered, but pressure was returning to the net. The ocean was no longer open to the 3 submarines. It was beginning to close around them. The first mistake had already been made by the Iranians. The second would be believing they still had time to slip away. Dawn arrived slowly, but the strike group did not wait for daylight. By the time the horizon began separating sea from sky, the carrier had already changed the shape of the encounter. From a distance, it looked almost unchanged. Gray hull steady, wake clean. Deck crews moving with disciplined control. But the surface calm concealed a deliberate shift in geometry. The ship was no longer only protecting itself, it was shaping the water around it, forcing every submerged contact to react to American movement instead of following its own plan. That was the moment the balance turned. On the flight deck, the first helicopters had already cycled through and lifted again. Rotor wash tore across painted lines and tied down equipment as crews worked through refuel, rearm, and relaunch with the kind of speed that only repetition creates. No one ran, no one shouted, hands moved, signals flashed, wheels rolled. The deck stayed orderly because everyone on it knew that disorder would waste the one thing the strike group could not afford to lose. Timing. Below deck's Combat Information Center no longer looked like a room recovering from surprise. It looked like a room taking control of a system. The tactical plot had thickened with data. Bearings from escorts, sonobuoy returns, dipping sonar readings, speed estimates, thermal layer adjustments, noise profiles. The 3 submarines were still not fixed with equal certainty, but they were no longer operating in darkness. Every minute they remained in the water, they revealed more about themselves. One contact stayed deep and careful. One had already shown a tendency to overcorrect. The third still moved with disciplined silence, making it the most dangerous precisely because it had not yet been forced to choose between concealment and action. The carrier's bridge received another maneuver recommendation. Slight course adjustment, controlled speed variation, not chaos, not panic, precision. That difference mattered. A panicked ship damages its own defensive picture. A controlled ship complicates enemy targeting while keeping its own screen clear. The bow came over a few degrees, nothing dramatic. Nothing a casual observer would even notice. But underwater, a few degrees can rewrite everything. It can alter timing, change approach angles, and force a submarine commander to recalculate a solution he may have only partially built. The carrier was not running from the threat. It was denying the threat clean mathematics. Around it, the destroyers extended that same logic. One escort crossed outward and held a new lane, forcing one submarine deeper than it wanted to go. Another shifted just enough to close the western side of the search box, narrowing the water available for a silent withdrawal. Above them, the Seahawks continued dropping sonobuoys in staggered fields, building an invisible fence of listening points across the carrier's projected path. This was no longer an ambush. It was a trap that had changed owners. Inside the sonar spaces of the screen ships, operators kept cutting through the noise. One Iranian contact tried to settle beneath the thermal layer and stay there, using colder water to bend sound away from the American net. Another began releasing decoys, sending false returns into the water picture in short, misleading bursts. For a few moments, the board blurred with phantom echoes. The Americans did not rush. That was the difference. False contacts were marked, compared, timed, and stripped away. The real submarine had a rhythm the decoys could not copy. Propeller beat, hull noise, tiny variations in movement. The false echoes drifted. The real contact made decisions. Contact holding below layer. Decoys in the water. Possible genuine transient beyond false field. Every call reduced uncertainty. Then one helicopter moved directly over the suspected position. The Seahawk settled into a steady hover and lowered its dipping sonar once more. The cable ran down into the morning water, disappearing beneath the surface like a line dropped into something alive. The helicopter held position above it, suspended over the sea with the precision of a needle over a pulse point. Inside the aircraft, the crew listened. They adjusted the depth, listened again, waited. The ocean answered slowly at first, then with more shape. A faint return became clearer. A broken suggestion became something that trained ears could hold on to. Back inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, no one spoke unless the words mattered. The room had reached that rare kind of silence where every person understood that one careless sentence could become noise. Then the return strengthened. It was not a moment for celebration. No one cheered, no one relaxed. But it was enough for certainty. One of the 3 submarines had been localized. A fire control quality track did not automatically mean an immediate response had to follow. It did not mean the next decision was simple, but it meant something almost as important. One of the attackers had lost the freedom to move without consequence. It had been found in the exact water where it needed to remain invisible. The initiative shifted there, quietly and decisively, on the bridge of one destroyer. Officers watched the updated bearing line and understood the meaning of the track. A submarine that had entered the engagement under concealment was now pinned inside an American solution set. If it held its course, it remained exposed. If it changed depth, it risked becoming louder. If it accelerated, it would confirm more than it could hide. That submarine was no longer stalking the carrier, it was trying to survive the net around it. But the danger had not passed. Because while one contact was being fixed and boxed in, another began moving across the projected route of the carrier with a patience that felt deliberate. It was not fast. It was not reckless. It was not the panicked motion of a commander who had lost control. That was what made it worse. It was calm enough to suggest intention and close enough to change the entire emotional balance of the encounter. The Americans had proven they could find one submarine. Now they had to stop the second from turning caution into a clean launch opportunity. The tactical display updated again. A new line crept inward. One submarine had been located. The second was now moving into a position that could turn the first mistaken contact into something far more deliberate. Inside CIC, the board changed before anyone had time to explain it. A new transient flashed across the acoustic picture. Brief, sharp, unmistakable to the people trained to hear danger beneath water. It was not a full detonation. Not yet. It was something smaller, tighter, and in that moment, more alarming. The kind of sound that makes experienced watch teams stop trusting the silence around it. One operator called it first, possible tube activity. No one repeated the words. They did not need to. For the last several minutes, the strike group had been tightening its grip on the 3 submarines beneath the surface. One had been forced deeper. One had already given itself away through movement. One had stayed patient enough to remain dangerous. Now, the patient one was no longer merely sitting inside the tactical picture. It was doing something. For half a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then every voice sharpened. The carrier's projected route updated. A new vector appeared across the display. One destroyer requested confirmation on the bearing line. Another reported improving contact strength from the western sector. Overhead, the nearest Seahawk adjusted its orbit and accelerated toward the new datum point. On the carrier's bridge, the recommendation arrived hard and clean. Come right, increase speed. The response was immediate. The aircraft carrier began to turn, not in panic. Not with a wild break that would tear apart its own defensive picture. It was a controlled change in heading, firm enough to disrupt whatever geometry might already be forming beneath the surface. The screws bit deeper into the sea. The bow came over across the formation. The huge ship shifted with the controlled weight of something too large to hurry, but too disciplined to hesitate. The escorts moved with it. Each destroyer adjusted in response, widening the problem for the submarine that had just revealed intent. Whether a launch had already happened or whether the crew below had only been preparing for one, the meaning was clear enough. A second attempt was either coming or had nearly begun. In the destroyer's sonar rooms, headsets pressed tighter against ears. Operators searched for the one sound that mattered now, a moving underwater track separate from the submarine itself. A torpedo in the water would not sound like a maneuvering boat, but the first seconds could be blurred by ocean layers, hull flow, propeller noise, and the carrier's own maneuver. That uncertainty became the pressure of the moment. Everyone involved understood the truth. If the submarine had launched, seconds mattered. If it had not launched yet, those same seconds were the last chance to stop it from gaining a clean solution. The nearest escort went active. The first sonar ping struck through the water like a challenge. It rolled outward beneath the surface, artificial, unmistakable, and impossible to ignore. Passive listening had been a quiet search. This was different. This announced that the Americans were no longer simply listening for shadows. They were forcing the undersea space to answer. It also removed any remaining ambiguity. Every submarine below now knew the strike group had shifted from hidden tracking to direct prosecution. The return came back almost immediately. One contact broke pattern, not wildly, not upward in a panic, but enough. enough to reveal movement where there had been silence, enough to confirm that the patient submarine had been forced into a decision. Inside CIC, the tactical plot tightened around that single motion. Bearings locked more firmly, the speed estimate increased, depth changed slightly. The contact was no longer an unknown shape somewhere ahead of the carrier's route. It was now a reacting submarine under pressure. It had to choose between concealment and position. It could not have both anymore. Above the water, the Seahawk came in low and fast over the suspected sector. The crew released another sonobuoy pattern, then went straight into a hover. The dipping sonar went down again, cable unspooling into the water with exact, unforgiving precision. Beneath the aircraft, the sea looked flat and indifferent. But below that surface, one submarine was running out of options. The geometry of its plan was collapsing. If the Iranian commander held course, he risked remaining inside an American fire control picture. If he dove deeper, he could give up position and lose the opportunity entirely. If he accelerated, he would become louder. If he turned away, he would confirm what the Americans already suspected. The attempt had failed. Survival was replacing the mission. That was where the encounter opened up. The submarine moved. Not enough for any eye above the water to see, more than enough for the net. Its shift in bearing moved across the destroyer displays almost instantly. One escort called a cleaner line. The helicopter crew reported stronger convergence from buoy returns. Another ship, farther off the carrier's beam, now had enough continuity to begin building a more complete solution. What had been a threat vector was becoming a tracked target. The carrier continued through its turn, speed increasing, posture stable, flight deck still functioning under pressure. No unnecessary alarms. No wasted orders, no confusion bleeding into procedure. The ship did not pass through the second danger point because of luck. It did so because every part of the formation was connected to the same system. Bridge, CIC, destroyers, helicopters, sonar teams, communications, flight deck crews. Each movement was part of a design made for exactly this kind of compressed crisis. Elsewhere beneath the surface, the other two submarines were no longer shaping the encounter either. The first, likely the boat that had triggered the original mistaken strike, had gone from hunter to fugitive. Its movement had flattened. It was cautious now, less interested in pursuit than in staying outside the tightening American picture. The second, already pressured by destroyer maneuver, was drifting westward with the clear behavior of a commander trying to preserve an escape option before the water closed around him completely. The initiative had reversed. Less than an hour earlier, 3 submarines had entered attack space around an American carrier, believing the darkness gave them control. Now one was pinned under active pressure. One was breaking away. One was trying not to lose what remained of its concealment. Inside CIC, nobody called it victory. That word did not belong in a room where 3 armed submarines still existed beneath the surface. What mattered was simpler and more useful. The underwater picture was no longer contested the way it had been minutes before. It was being controlled. A U.S. destroyer held a track. A Seahawk held pressure overhead. The carrier had denied the firing lane, and the submarine that had tried to build a second opportunity had exposed itself in the attempt. What began as an ambush had reversed completely. The hunters were now the ones being held in place by American steel, sonar, timing, and disciplined movement. Morning broke fully over the Arabian Sea, and the carrier was still there. That was the first fact that mattered. Not disabled. Not drifting. Not forced out of formation. Still underway. Still inside the screen, still generating controlled movement across a surface that less than an hour earlier had concealed 3 submarines closing around the wrong target. On the flight deck, the pace remained urgent but controlled. Helicopters recovered, refueled, and lifted again. Deck crews moved under the growing light with the same practice rhythm they had carried through the dark. The carrier had absorbed the first underwater shock and passed through the most dangerous phase of the encounter without surrendering control of the battle space. Damage control teams had already confirmed what every watchstander needed to hear. The carrier remained operational. That changed the meaning of everything that followed, because the Iranian move had depended on one advantage above all others: confusion at the moment of contact, surprise, misidentification. A strike delivered before the American formation could fully understand what had entered its space. For several seconds, that advantage had existed. Then it disappeared. The submarines had not found an isolated ship. They had not caught a soft target alone in the dark. They had struck inside the defensive orbit of a U.S. carrier strike group and activated the exact system built to deny them a second clean chance. By full daylight, that reversal was complete. One submarine remained under pressure, held inside a narrowing box of sonar coverage, helicopter presence, and destroyer maneuver. It had not been removed from the fight in some sudden cinematic moment. The sea rarely works that way, but it had lost freedom of action. And in undersea warfare, that loss can be more decisive than visible damage. A submarine that can no longer freely choose its depth, speed, and course is no longer shaping events. It is reacting to them. A second submarine had begun pulling away westward, choosing distance over aggression, trading attack geometry for survival. It had entered the encounter as part of a coordinated movement. It was leaving as an escaping contact. The third, most likely the boat that had triggered the original mistaken contact, had become the most revealing outcome of all. It was still beneath the surface. It was still dangerous in the way any concealed submarine remains dangerous. But its acoustic pattern, maneuver habits, timing, and response to American pressure had now been captured across multiple sensors. That mattered. The encounter had not only stopped the immediate danger, it had created intelligence the U.S. Navy would carry long after the water closed over the scene. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the tone had changed from compressed crisis to controlled exploitation. The tactical display still glowed with bearings, returns, projected paths, and air coordination tracks. But the emotional center of the room had shifted. It was no longer dominated by fear of the next strike. It was about consolidation. Log it, verify it, refine the picture. Make sure nothing from the encounter disappears into memory, assumption, or guesswork. On the escorts, sonar teams continued holding and sorting the contacts. Every transient was noted. Every change in propeller rhythm was examined. Every maneuver that had once looked threatening was now also evidence. The Americans had seen how the submarines approached. They had seen how the three boats separated roles. They had seen how quickly one commander lost patience. They had seen how another tried to hide beneath the thermal layer. They had seen how the quietest of the three behaved once active pressure forced it to move. That was the final cost of striking the wrong carrier. The Iranian boats had not simply failed to achieve decisive results. They had exposed themselves while trying. Above them, the carrier kept moving. That image carried more force than any dramatic blast ever could. Gray hull cutting forward, wake forming clean behind the stern, aircraft handling continuing, escorts rebuilding their geometry around the center of the formation, flight operations adjusting but not collapsing, systems absorbing stress without losing discipline. It was not dramatic in the way people imagine naval combat from a distance. It was colder than that, more controlled, more convincing. Continuity. That was the message written across the water. The Americans had taken an underwater strike, identified multiple submarines inside the threat envelope, denied a second clean attempt, reversed the tactical balance, and continued the mission. Not because the moment was easy, not because the submarines were harmless, but because the strike group did what it was built to do. It converted surprise into procedure, pressure into geometry, danger into motion. By late morning, the encounter was no longer a live ambush. It had become a completed lesson. The Iranian plan had depended on darkness, compression, and the belief that one fast misread opportunity could disrupt an American formation before it organized itself. Instead, the first strike activated the entire defensive web around the carrier. Once that happened, every passing minute favored the United States. The submarines were no longer deciding the pace. They were being measured by it. This was never truly the story of three submarines that nearly brought down an American carrier. It was the story of three submarines that entered the wrong stretch of ocean at the wrong moment and awakened the full weight of what protects a U.S. aircraft carrier at sea. They thought they had found an opening in the dark. What they actually found was the most heavily defended piece of water they could have chosen.